underrepresented minorities, looking for women and others, so that we can look at what we need for law enforcement in the state. What this would mean is that we would look at a talent acquisition strategy that would be able to leverage the data analytics, that we're in a position to do the type of recruitment that we need for the state. And then once we were in a position to look at strategies, a critical piece of this is, if we have the applicants and we're getting what we need, we have to ensure the hiring process is where it needs to be, in terms of it being a level playing field and that there's equity. Sometimes we look at equality and there is the potential for barriers. So how do we look at our hiring processes along with our talent acquisition strategy, so that we can ensure that we're in a position to get the type of talent that we need? And then I think at that point, if you look at the next level of this, is when you hire someone, your work has just begun. So what do we do in terms of the retention? What are we doing in terms of their professional development? And so when you look at the training aspects, we're looking and requesting the type of training that would look at continuing education, that would look at what they need to be successful in their roles in terms of de-escalation, diversity training, cultural sensitivity, racial, and et cetera, in terms of how do we ensure that they have access to continuing education. And if we're going to have a standard for education, as them being law enforcement and correction officers, how do we look at that in terms of assisting when needed, in terms of them having access to higher level education, if they want to continue from an associate's and get a bachelor's and et cetera. So it's looking at talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention from the very beginning to when you actually have someone on board, but also saying, okay, our work has just begun. What do we do in terms of the training to ensure that they have what they need to be successful in their roles? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Barbara. And next to discuss is Ibukun, who's going to talk about the 1033 Act and some legislative recommendations that our group has.
Good afternoon. So I am addressing a few legislative priorities, starting with the 1033 Act. The short-term suggestion for that was to create an executive order for the exclusion of military-grade equipment purchases and donations from the 1033 Act as it applies to the New Mexico State Police. The other short-term suggestion will be to create an annual request for peer report of all state agencies' use and possession of military-grade equipment, including progress toward the reduced use and or disposal of such equipment within New Mexico State Police. We will also move into the legislation for the statewide use of force policy, asking to create a legislation for a statewide ban of no-knock warrants, both with the state and local police agencies, as well as creation of legislation for a statewide ban of neck and choke holds, both within the state and local police agencies. We reserved for a long-term plan the demilitarization of New Mexico police agencies, also still focused on the 1033 Act, with the express goal of imposing a ban on the possession, maintenance, and deployment of military-grade weaponry by law enforcement agencies all through New Mexico. And we want to specify that whether that is acquired through the 1033 Act or any other means, that will be expressly banned in the state of New Mexico. And in order to come up with these ideas, we did have a presentation by Kelly Hamilton. Kelly Hamilton is the person in charge of right now preserving and coordinating the 1033 Act execution within the state of New Mexico, he did give us quite a bit of information about what equipments are out there, what different agencies within the state currently have. And looking through that information, we were able to parse through and make the decision as to what we need to specifically attempt to exclude from use and possession within the police agencies that we have here in New Mexico. That'll be it on focus area 2.
Thank you so much, Ibukun. And finally, the third focus area for our group was on private prisons. And to present that information are Dr. Ben Bencomo and Christopher Ramirez.
Hello, muy buenas tardes, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for having us here today. Alexandria, what a beautiful way to start the meeting. So thank you for that moment to help us center. I think it's a interesting and somewhat difficult time for most of us. So just to give you a little bit of background, we in the Public Safety and Law Enforcement Subcommittee had an opportunity to meet with our Cabinet Secretary Tafoya Lucero for the Department of Corrections, and we've also engaged in some background research related to the use of private prison facilities in the state of New Mexico. Just to give you a little bit of that background, a recent study published in U.S. News and World Report found that New Mexico leads the nation in terms of our reliance on private prison corporations and for the housing of our jailed population. In 2019, about half of our jailed population were held in private prison facilities. This is compared to a number of about 8% nationwide. This number doesn't even take into account private facilities that are run or contracted by Immigration and Customs as well. So that number is even higher when we put those numbers in there. New Mexico Political Report also recently published information obtained through ACLU New Mexico that privately run ICE facility in Otero County had reached out to local county officials asking for more inmates to help offset their bottom line during the current COVID pandemic. I think that these two reports especially sort of highlight some of the concerns that we have seen, right? We know that the use of private prison facilities has been pretty widespread and deeply ingrained in New Mexico's corrections community for some time now, since the Johnson administration. But what we know is that we have disproportionately high rates of Latinx. We make up about 48% of the state's population and 60% of the jailed population. African Americans in New Mexico make up about 2% of the population, but about 4% of our jail population, and indigenous New Mexicans make up about 9% of our population, but 13% of our jailed population. So we see this overrepresentation across the board among these different ethnic communities, and this is a concern. We know that the use of private prison facilities is concerning because of these efforts to advocate for more inmates and for longer sentences that have been going on here in New Mexico. So among other things. So with that, we've come up with 2 short-term and 3 long-term suggestions related to private prison facilities in New Mexico. The first short-term suggestion is we would like to see a memorandum of understanding be put in place between our New Mexico State Department of Corrections, which oversees the remaining 4 private prison facilities, that requires their employees to complete all of the same training that's required of our Department of Corrections employees. We hope that that will be bumped up with some implicit bias, verbal de-escalation, and racial sensitivity training as well. Also, that any investigations related to possible misconduct be investigated at the same level as State Corrections Department employees. A second recommendation that we have in terms of a short-term recommendation is that we would like to see a strategic plan developed in terms of mobilizing efforts to systematically divest from these private prison facilities in New Mexico. Long-term suggestions, we would like to see a 5-year plan come out of that strategic plan that within those 5 years, New Mexico look at taking back control of those 4 remaining private prison facilities. We recommend that legislation be drafted and put forward that would prohibit private prison entities from donating to campaigns in the state of New Mexico. And then eventually, one of our long-term goals would be to see a permanent ban be put in place in terms of private prison facility use in the state of New Mexico.
Thank you so much, Ben. So those are the first three focus areas from our group, as well as some short and long-term recommendations. And so I guess now I'm not sure if I turn it back to Alexandria or we just open it up for questions, but I will.
Yeah, I think we just open it up for questions from council members. Thank you all so much. I think I've enjoyed attending some of your subcommittee meetings, and you all have had some really vibrant and deep discussions. And so thank you for being here today and for all your work on this. And so let's open up for any questions, comments, discussion at this time while we have our subcommittee members with us. I see. Austin, are you able to come on mic? If not, I can read your question. So Austin says, how would that recommendation around accepting donations for public officials prevent donations not infringe on freedom of speech relevant to Citizens United?
That I'll just jump in on that one. That's something that we definitely would have to take a look at, right? We would have to look at what is the difference between protections that are afforded to private citizens versus protections that are put in place, or allowances that are put in place for some of these lobbying groups, private prison facilities and corporations being one of them. Obviously, I don't think we could legally ban donations from private citizens, excuse me. But when we look at legislation in other states, you can see that there have been restrictions that have been put in place in terms of what form of lobbying is allowed from private entities and from corporations that are directly linked to some of these private prison facilities. I don't know if Dr. Ozenlu or anyone else would like to jump in and add to that.
I was just going to echo what Ben said, that there have been other restrictions put in place in other states. And I think it's just something we can begin to look at, seeing the humongous sort of overabundance of people we have represented in private prisons here in New Mexico. So it's one way to start down this avenue to explore. Thank you.
I see another question asking, Barbara, could you clarify the minimum qualifications for police officers? I am not sure if I heard it properly, but is it 18 years with an associate degree?
And I can jump in on this one too. It is 18 years of age, and I believe the chief of the state police who we spoke with said it was 60 hours, which is equivalent to an associate's degree. Barbara, if you want to add anything.
So that's correct.
Thank you. And in some of the research we did as a group, we noted that around the country, the standards are a little bit higher in places, whether it's 21 years of age or an undergraduate degree is required, things like that.
Joanna, would you like to come on mic?
Yes, thank you, Chair Alex. I'm going to stay off video, though. Y'all don't want to see what's happening over here after elections yesterday. But thank you so much for the subcommittee. That was a really great presentation. I'm curious about, I know you mentioned, right, that some of the data you provided didn't necessarily include the immigrant detention centers, and I've certainly been part of that work in Southern New Mexico around immigrant detention centers. Is your proposal inclusive of that, phasing those out as well? And if so, with any officials you spoke to, did you get any pushback on that in terms of like state and federal jurisdictions and things like that? I'm curious what you all sort of came up with on that end.
Ben, I was going to say, did you want to jump in on this one?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure, no problem. So in our discussions,
And we're not related, by the way. I don't know.
I know it's nice to meet you though, but it's
You
a little
too.
strange to see another Ben Como. We're not exactly the Smiths of New Mexico, I don't think. But let's see, I lost my train of thought. Oh, when we were speaking to Cabinet Secretary Tafoya Lucero, she did mention that there is a difference there, right? As we're talking about contracts between federal entities, Immigration and Customs, versus contracts between the State Department of Corrections. I'm not exactly sure where that line is drawn, but I do know that she mentioned that current oversights that DOC has with the private prison facilities aren't necessarily the same with those private entities that house ICE inmates. So there is a difference there, and I'm not quite sure how much jurisdiction the state would have in terms of those inmates in those facilities because of the fact that they're contracted at the federal level. So I'm not quite sure, to be honest. But at least in our interactions with Cabinet Secretary Tafoya Lucero, it seemed as though there would be a difference there. Currently, there's 4 private facilities. There was 5 that the state of New Mexico does contract with for housing our state inmates. The Clayton facility at the end of 2019 was taken over by the state of New Mexico. So we're down to 4, but those 4 are the ones that our recommendations are directed towards.
If I can just add something real quick, I thank you for that. I appreciate that. And you know, I will say that someone who works in in immigration advocacy, that the really tough thing about those detention centers and really awful thing is that they pass the buck around. So in terms of enforcement and oversight, they have some of the worst human rights abuses, right? Otero and the one in Torrance County that has one of the only transgender pods in the country. And when you ask them for like oversight and accountability, they will say, well, it's the county. Well, no, it's ICE. Well, no, it's the state. And so they just pass the buck around and nothing ever gets done. And I will say, though, that I once had a conversation, which could be worth having again, with Secretary McCamley in terms of at the end of the day, New Mexico has a right to regulate business within our borders. And it is a business, right? Like it is a business entity. And so I wonder if there's some sort of pathway there so that these can be included. But thank you. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Janine, and then Rabbi Linick. Janine, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. Okay, I'm going to go to Rabbi Linick, and then I'll check the chat for Janine.
Thanks, Alexandria. My question regarding Act 1033, I'm wondering what narrative is put forth by law enforcement to support militarization, and in addition, is it feasible for us to develop a counter narrative that'll be effective?
I'll go ahead and answer that as best as I can with the information we've gathered. What we're seeing is the singular most popular explanation is the fact that it's easy to access these resources through the 1033 Act. The 1033 Act, we learned, covers a lot of different resources, not just military equipment, but even simpler, more basic, all the way down to simple office equipment like filing cabinets. And so the cost of not having to purchase that, but receiving that through this act is something that the police departments value greatly. And because of the ease of access to all these military grade equipments, along with the simpler regular office supplies, if you may, they go ahead and just take them. And so that is the most common explanation that there is for that. And I think that the counter argument for that will be, and we have not fully delved into this area, but what is the cost of utilizing these equipment. The bigger it is, the costlier it is, to maintain, to deploy. And we find that most police agencies don't have any need to deploy this equipment. And as we've seen, it's only in times of protest that all of a sudden the military grade equipment come out to be shown to the people that we have it and we have the capacity to deal with whatever is out there. But if we look at the second suggestion that we have about peer reporting, I think that'll be helpful in creating a counter narrative to this, which is, what do you have and how often do you use it, and what is the cost of just having it, right? And so we're not just taking away something that is actually valuable to these police agencies. We're taking away something that probably costs them more than it benefits them, and obviously doesn't benefit our community.
And I just
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the question, Rabbi, and thank you, Ibuka. And I just wanted to add that in our group did a deep dive and did some research, and we were able to find a list statewide what each state received in terms of militarized items, whether, as Ibuka said, something as simple as a file cabinet to an assault rifle for each state. And that was, I think, from June 30th, 2020. And so if this larger group is interested in seeing that information, we can share that spreadsheet as well.
I think that would be good. And Dr. Romero has a similar question to what I have, and that is, how is militarization defined? And Dr. Romero, I don't know if there's more you would like to add to that question, but.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Ibuka, Dr. O'Shandler, I was just curious what the conversation's been around that. You know, I think of different categories. We're talking about maybe weaponry. Are we talking about tactics? Are we talking about vehicles? Are we talking about training? Is it all those things? Just where is the boundary for that?
Thank you, Dr. Romero. I can jump in and say we're definitely looking, one of the things we are looking at is military grade weaponry. And then I know that there has been concern with military grade weaponry, military tactics being used in communities to police communities, especially communities of color. So I know for sure we have those two avenues we're interested in. I don't know if Ben and Ibuka want to jump in and add anything else.
So from being able to see what these equipments are and these weaponry are that our state has access to, we're able to start to define, okay, what exactly out of these items actually are military grade weaponry, as opposed to regular police items that will be needed. And so the definition of what is militarized policing is something that we definitely need to look deeper into and find maybe actually coin the language that will go into this executive order that we're asking to be done. But we come up with that term based on the specific information that we have, which Dr. Sonlu and Shani will definitely share with the main group, because I think it's something we should all see what is out there. There are militarized vehicles. There are simple night vision sights. There are more complex stuff. There are things that just seem like war equipment, as opposed to simpler things like just a rifle, just ammo. You know, it's everything. It's a wide variety of things that are being supplied under this act. And so breaking down that definition of what is militarization, right, will come down to what items on this list do we need to actually get under control and out of the hands of our local police, that they, and like I stated earlier, I think a big part of it will be just gathering data, just gathering information from these agencies. If you don't use it unless there's a protest, you probably don't need it, right? So that kind of information will have to come from the local police agencies. And that is data that we have not collected that will definitely be useful in making that definition. I'm not aware of any militarized training that comes directly from the military or wherever that comes from. That's not something that we've discussed as a group. That's not something that I'm aware of that happens in New Mexico. But if anybody has information that happens, I'm sure we'll be more than happy to dive into researching and getting some more legislative priorities in line with that.
Thank you. Dr. Romero, I saw your hand.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I do think sharing that list would be important. That way we have a shared understanding of have an idea of what we're talking about specifically when we're looking at this. Janine's question says, in the presentation, it was said the intention of the ban and the requirements around phasing out military-grade weaponry would apply to all state and local police departments. Is this correct? Because the document actually only references state police, and I was wondering how this does or does not apply to local police departments, ICE, etc.
I think I can jump in on that one, and Barbara, feel free to jump in too. We kind of worked on this first one a lot together, but we were cautioned and told that we had to look at state law enforcement and not local law enforcement. That's sort of what was the purview of what our charge was to look at, and that basically local police had a different sort of entity that I guess they answer to. So we were just to focus on state police.
Thank you. And I think my understanding, and Amy can help guide that as well. I think my understanding is in the case of an executive order, what is under the governor's purview would be state police. If that led to legislation that potentially impacted all police departments in the state, but under an executive order, I think the governor only has the ability to order the state police in that regard.
I believe the long-term suggestion around ending all militarization was encompassing of all law enforcement organizations, because that would be statute, but the short-term suggestion would only apply to New Mexico State Police and New Mexico Corrections Department.
Thank you. And Fatima, I've seen your hand. Thank you for your patience.
Oh, no worries. First of all, thank you all so much for all of your work on this. It's so thorough. So thank you for that. And I had a question around the first focus area around recruitment and training for state police. And it's sort of a broader question that's really about, is there data around what the New Mexico, I guess, Police Department, the state PD actually spends their time on? And I'm asking this because, you know, before we recruit for a job, we usually assess what the needs are, and then we develop a job description. And just nationally, there's so much data right now that's really indicating that, you know, 9 out of 10 police calls are for nonviolent encounters, that less than 20% of citizen calls are for serious crime, and that the bulk of what police are responding to are really social service issues related to substance use, behavioral health, homelessness. And so I'm wondering, before we talk about recruitment frameworks for police, should there be part of our conversation or recommendation be around what are we recruiting for? And if we're really looking at data around what are police doing, then what should we be recruiting for? You know, should we actually really propose recruiting more social workers or community support aides? And so it's like, and this is in addition to what you've proposed, meaning like, obviously, there's still violent crime. You know, perhaps we still need this. And, you know, should there be a proposal for recruitment for folks that aren't necessarily armed or responding in the same way that police are, just given what we're seeing nationally? So I'm kind of wondering about that, if that was part of your conversation at the subcommittee, and how you all were approaching that topic. And then I had a further second question about training, which maybe I'll just ask now, if that's okay. So that's question one. The second question is really about, just curriculum in general. And again, nationally, a lot of the data just shows if, you spend 300 hours on police tactics and then 8 on de-escalation, then in, obviously in a time of crisis, and I'm sure you all are super aware of this at the subcommittee level, you revert back, right, to what you've been trained around the most. So I'm wondering if there's also a longer term suggestion around an overall assessment of the police academy curriculum that's not really looking at add-on trainings, but what is the whole frame for public safety that we're training people around, and looking at that kind of with a critical lens. And if that was part of the discussion as well. And thank you all again for this, amount of work. It's a lot.
This is Barbara. What I would say is that we recently just met with the deputy chief.
You're cutting out pretty bad.
Looking at some of what you're talking about, I think
Try now, I think so.
Is this
It's very choppy.
I think we can hear you when the video's off. Yes.
Yeah, I think when your video is off, we can hear you better.
Is that better?
Yes, it is.
What I was beginning to state is that we actually had an opportunity to meet with the deputy chief for the state police, and he went over our presentation with us that we should be able to share that talks about what you were referencing in terms of the calls that they have, their roles or responsibilities, and what that looks like across the state. When we were talking to him, we had requested some additional information from a diversity perspective in terms of race and et cetera, so that we could have a better understanding of what the data that we have, what it meant in terms of that level. With regard to the training aspect of it, let me take a step back. With regard to the other piece of the recruitment, when you're looking at the social workers and other pieces, I think that's something that we should take into consideration. There has been conversations around law enforcement, the role of social workers, and how can we look at those calls differently. So I think that's something that we have to take into consideration. I think another piece that you have to take into consideration is term of that staff that they need, because in some of the conversations that we've had, part of the issue has come to the appropriate staffing levels that they need to support the work that they're doing. Did I miss anything from that first part of the question?
I also want to point you to the proposal that we sent, is that suggestion is put in there as a memorial, right? So that the suggestion is to have a memorial to study what is needed. And so I think that really addresses your question, Fatima, and that also, possible connecting that with Representative Chasey's bill that we heard from her 2, maybe 3 meetings ago, as her bill is a task force to study what kind of training is needed or what is the model for training. So those 2 things could be connected with each other, or you can decide to suggest them as 2 separate things as well.
And Amy and others, this is Christopher. Can I also answer that question that Fatima asked about? Because I think a great suggestion around this memorial would also be exactly what you said, Fatima, is to continue to explore, because we asked about that in the presentation of how can calls, just like we're looking at, for example, locally here in Albuquerque, how can some calls like domestic violence calls, because I know that the deputy director mentioned those in particular, right? How can we move some of those calls into other agencies within the state so that we're doing less to criminalize communities and providing more resources. I think you have a really strong sense that that should also be included as we start to understand how our state police works and how we can address racial justice and decriminalizing communities and shifting resources instead of criminalizing and having an officer with a weapon arrive when that's not needed.
Thank you. Any more questions on that topic specifically around the training? I think last week at the health subcommittee, it was reported by the Human Services Division that they just received, I believe, I don't have my notes up from that meeting, I think like $6 million for the LEAD program, which is situated in law enforcement, but it's supposed to be to divert calls and have other responses than officers. And so I don't know like how much of that the state police would be applying for, other local police departments. And so there might be also space to explore what that program is and what can be done with that, although it's still situated within law enforcement. And then there are questions if you can reiterate the stats you shared about the corrections department and the percentages by ethnicity of representation.
Sure, this has Ben, and this information was taken from a 2019 snapshot by the Vera Institute of Justice. So these are pretty current, last year's numbers, but the Latinx makeup is 48% of the state population and 60% of the jailed population. African American, 2% of the overall state population, and double that, 4% of the jailed population. And Native American Indigenous, 9% of the population, 13% of the jailed population.
And we also received that information, and so Shawnee can share that with your group, the larger group too.
Yeah, I think that would be great. We like information. We like information, so I think that would be great. Are there any other questions or comments, discussion at this time for the members of the subcommittee that have joined us?
There's a question from the audience. They're wondering if you might be able to put that article, the name of the article or the reference in the chat.
I guess which article? The one that Ben just referenced, or the 1033 list of military grade equipment?
I believe the reference on the prison.
I don't know if, and this could be just a user error, I don't know if I have access to load things up in the chat. I maybe do, but if not, maybe Shawnee, do you have that handy?
Are we referring to the stats that were provided in the presentation by the Chief of Police? I do have that slide deck. I can send to the full council and I will locate the article reference. I'm not sure that that's there. I will look.
Thank you. And the 1033, yeah, I sent that email to both Shawnee and Alexandra. Again, it's could be user error. I don't think I have the ability to put things into the chat for some reason, but thank you.
It's okay. This platform is a bit different. I'm not as good at navigating it either. I think we are at a decision point because we agreed at the council level that one of our priority areas was going to be law enforcement and public safety. And so I think we're at the point of making a decision on what parts and whether we want to accept these suggestions from the subcommittee as a part of our recommendations that are going to be forwarded on to the governor. There are other specific law enforcement related bills that we've also heard from here on the council that we will be deciding on and including on that list. or I mean, the discussion and conversation today has been also engaging and valuable. And so are there suggestions that we would like added into this that you want the subcommittee to add into this at this time? Or can we make those additions now and make a decision about what parts of this plan, if all, we would like to move forward as a part of our greater recommendations under our priority area? So any discussion, any moves to accept it or accept a focus area number 1, add to it? Yes, Mr. Sanchez, we're really at that decision point.
Well,
Yes, we can hear you now. Oh, no, you just muted yourself again.
okay, now,
Yes.
yeah, I would make a motion, because we operate by consensus. It's really not a vote up or down, but it's, if anyone has issue with it, then we can still work with them. But I think you take a vote and there's a consensus, then you're ready to move it on. And I'd make a motion to call for a consensus on this. And if you call for a vote of that, you'd have my thumbs up.
Thank you, Mr. Sanchez. So a motion to agree to accept the full report from this committee, and the ability, I think there's still the ability to add some of the additional language that we discussed today.
I would definitely second that. There's some tweaking to language,
Sure.
maybe specifics and definitions, but yes, I think we're definitely on the right track.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Is there agreement to that? You can just do a thumbs up or we have a lot of people. Thank you for also putting it in the chat. Great.
I think I would like to see it, before an outright vote accepting it, I would like to see if there's, I know it's a memorial to sort of assess, but that there be language that this isn't strictly recruiting police in their current form, or at least that's part of the consideration, and maybe something else about the broader curriculum or consideration in the long-term plan about that. If you all feel, again, this is consensus, but that would be my perspective.
Thank you for that. I did make note of your comment about with some of that language just in the rough draft form. And so we'll follow up on that so that we can finalize this piece of it and start moving it forward. And I see agreement with the same sentiments shared. Awesome. Amy, is there anything else on that you feel we need?
No, I think though, it sounds like what we're going to do is ask the committee to again, just kind of reform the language to you all's suggestions and turn it back to us again. And so I just ask that if anyone has very specific language that they would like for them to add, you can email it to me or Shawnee, and then we can make sure that the committee is able to add that in, and then we'll bring it back to the group again in the next meeting.
I agree with that, Amy. Thank you. And I don't think we'll have the opportunity to have the subcommittee members present again. And so I think that's a really great suggestion, so that by the time we review it again, we're ready to fully accept it. Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate all that you put into this.
Thank you so much. And we look forward to getting the sort of list of suggestions for improvement, and we'll go from there. So is it okay to the subcommittee can log off if they need to?
Absolutely. We really appreciate you all being here. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. All right, we will move to the next item on our agenda. I see Representative Javier Martinez here with us. Thank you. And I also think I saw Representative Momay Estes. Okay, there you are. There's a lot of squares on the screen. So thank you all for being here, and we'll just jump right in.
Thank you, Javier. Should I go first? Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ms. Taylor and everybody for having us. We're going to try to be as brief as we can and then answer as many questions as we can in the short time. I'm going to put a PowerPoint, if I can, on the screen, but just a brief history. As we all know, the United States invaded New Mexico in 1848, but we didn't become an official state until 1912. Many states, many territories rather, became states during that time with significantly less population. You know, Nevada, Nebraska, Colorado in the 1860s and 70s, Idaho and Wyoming in the 1990s. Wyoming had 60,000 people in 1890. New Mexico had 160,000 people. So fine, but you know, everyone knew it was kind of time for us to be a state, us in Arizona. The Ferguson Act was passed by Congress in 1898. Which laid the groundwork for us to become a state. The Ferguson Act outlined state lands that would become part of state government and how state lands would manage the resources derived from those lands. And then there was the Enabling Act of 1910, which kind of rubber stamped the 1898 Act. And then we became a state in 1912. The federal government granted the state of New Mexico, the government of the state of New Mexico, 13 million acres of land that's owned by the state, owned by us, and managed by the state land office. Stephanie Garcia Richard is our land commissioner. We also own as a state 9 million mineral rights. So for example, I could have a farm and have cows on the farm, but Javier could own the mineral rights underneath my farm and he owns the oil or the whatever is underneath my land. So anyway, we have tremendous, tremendous natural resources as a state. When we became a state, it was mostly timber, grazing, things like that. Crude oil was discovered in New Mexico in 1927. And then, of course, in the 80s, it was natural gas was the huge moneymaker, mostly in San Juan and other places. And now it's crude oil. In 1957, we created the State Investment Council. We were one of the first states to allow our land grant investment fund to invest in financial assets, global stocks. And then as recent as 2014, the people changed the Constitution to allow greater than 15% of that portfolio to go to international investments. So let me just share a brief did that work? I can't hear you.
No, we didn't. We
Okay,
can't see it.
Okay, let me try again.
There you go.
Did that work or no?
It did.
Okay, great. So anyway, briefly, so these are the beneficiaries. Literally in our Constitution, these, what were essentially the territorial governmental entities, were granted land. So each of these entities has kind of a property right, so to speak, to various tracts of land located throughout the state. Some of that land is barren, some of that land has crude oil, some of that land has very rich minerals underneath it. The common schools make up 86% of the land grant permanent fund money, but it also lists all of the schools, including School for the Deaf, the prison, Carrie Tingley Hospital, and other institutions. This is the growth of the land grant permanent fund on the left. From 2010, we had about $9 billion, and it has grown tremendously, where now there's over $20 billion in the fund. This on the right-hand side is the distribution, money that goes from the land grant permanent fund each year to the general fund to be appropriated by the legislature for the purpose of the beneficiary. So it has also grown from roughly $500 million a year to this past fiscal year, $836 million a year, which offsets stress on taxes and helps us budget tremendously for public schools. This is the money, however, that goes from the public lands directly to the state land office and then directly into the investment account. So not only does the fund grow 7% from financial investments, it grows about 4 or 5% each year as a result of just an influx of cash from the state land office that goes into the land grant permanent fund. Other states, when the United States allowed them to be states, they use that money directly into the general fund. they are allowed to spend that money today. We are not allowed to do that. All the money generated from the state land office goes into the investment account, not our checking account. And then, so here's kind of the way it works. We think about 5% distribution. We can't go above 5%. Well, we're not even close to 5%. And here's the reason why. When we went into session in January this past year, what we do is we take the amount of the fund from the previous 5 years, essentially New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. So we take these 5 data points, 14.4 billion, 15.1 on to 19.7. We average them, and that gives us an average 16.7 billion. So what we do is we take 5% of 16.7 billion, even though today the fund is 20 billion. And so what we do is we take 5% of 16.7 billion, that gives us the 836 million that I mentioned. We divide it by 12, and it goes in essentially monthly payments from the land grant permanent fund to the general fund to use for state government. So there's 12 equal payments throughout the fiscal year, the first one being July 1st, the last one being June 30th of 2021, nearly 6.5 years from that first data point. So the reason I say this is that when you do the math, the distribution in real time, money coming out of the investment account for education in New Mexico is closer to 4.2%, not 5%. And lastly, this is kind of tricky, but on the right-hand side, the column is the distribution in real time, given those monthly payments. And you see it hovers around 4.3 at the beginning of the fiscal year, dips under 4 from time to time. Now it's currently 4.2. It'll be about 3.9 towards the end of the fiscal year and next time. And so let me just get out of this. So here's my point, is that we are locked in. We are locked in as appropriators to this 122-year-old structure. These territorial agencies get money from the land grant permanent fund, derived from the fund. We're locked into this 5%, which is really 4.2%, and it has grown to the tune of $20 billion. There is a direct inverse correlation between the size of a state's general fund and the horrible well-being of their children. Some states have used their fund for many other things, economic growth, things like that. Arizona has a 6.9 distribution. So that kind of begs the question. One is why do we still have this old structure? Why do we have 21 beneficiaries? Why don't we just have one, which will make it easier for budgeting purposes and just go into education? And then two, why does money from the state land office go into the investment fund? I think we know why the federal government treated Arizona differently from New Mexico because of the demographics. Why shouldn't that money just go into the general fund to be used today? And then why only 5% rolling average? If we go 6% rolling average, that still doesn't get us close to generational equity. If we truly were to do the math and allocate every single year in real dollars the same, it would be closer to about 7.2% distribution. And we'll get that number as hopefully in the next month. We're working with the econ department at UNM, but those are just some general thoughts, and I'll turn it over to Representative Martinez.
Thank you, Representative Maestas. Can everybody hear me okay? Excellent. So I'll be very brief. Does the land grant fund continue to grow even after increasing the distribution by roughly 1%? The answer is yes. If you look at Legislative Finance Committee's own analysis, over the course of 2030, I think they go up to about a 40-year horizon. The land grant permanent fund continues to grow. It actually doubles in value within the next 10 to 15 years, even with the additional distribution. The difference is that you are taking part of this fund and you're investing it in New Mexico's youngest children through a host of programs and services beginning prenatal all the way until right before kindergarten. Things like home visitation, things like quality childcare, quality pre-K, and all of the wraparound services that we know children need and deserve. We know from economists, both conservative and more liberal kind, that investments in early childhood can yield upwards of 11, 12, 13% return on investment. We know that the more we can upstream these investments, the better it is in terms of the outcomes for the child and their family. So, the question before us is, are the children of New Mexico, 80% of whom are children of color, worthy of an additional investment from the Land Grant Permanent Fund, understanding that we're not putting the permanent fund at risk for future generations? We have to, I want to make that clear, because oftentimes those who oppose this legislation will tell you that we're risking the future of the fund. That's simply not true. Mathematically, it does not shake out. And I'm basing it on the analysis of the State Investment Council and the Legislative Finance Committee. Knowing that, then the question is, are the children worthy of the investment? Now, we know why it took New Mexico many years to become a state. It's been well documented. On the congressional record, there was a feeling among congressmen at the time, all of whom were white men, probably well-to-do, that New Mexico was too Mexican, quote. There's a fantastic book by Professor Laura Gomez called Manifest Destinies that explains a lot of this history that I would invite you all to read if you haven't already. Once New Mexico was granted statehood, what the federal government did is it imposed on us a land management and fiscal management system that essentially tied our hands behind our backs. And that persists to this day. Think about how difficult it is to add or take out, either way, a beneficiary from the Land Grant Permanent Fund. You've got to go through a legislative process. And if that is approved, then you've got to go to the voters for them to ratify it. In no other state that I know of, based on my research, have I seen another example like it. Mm-hmm. Now, we know the outcomes for our children. Whether you want to measure it by reading proficiency rates for fourth graders, or whether you want to rate it by hunger rates, or whether you want to rate it by child abuse rates, we know that New Mexico ranks at the bottom of the list in most of these outcomes. We have an opportunity here before us to invest in a substantive and permanent way and sustainable way in New Mexico's children by taking a small percentage from this land grant fund, which belongs to people. Let's think about where the land came that makes up the Land Grant Permanent Fund. Belongs to the people, and all we're saying is take a responsible percentage and invested in the children of the state of New Mexico. That's all we're doing. Now, what we've been told time and time again by the opponents, by the naysayers in the legislature primarily, but also in the chambers of commerce, is that we are sacrificing this fund, that we are going to render this fund insolvent. That is not the case. I can tell you with a straight face, and I will refer you to House Joint Resolution 1 on the legislative website. Read the fiscal impact analysis. It will not become insolvent, not even close. The fund continues to grow at a very healthy rate. The only difference is that we're investing it in our children and not just sending it off to Wall Street. The last point I want to make is that, after the murder, and there's no other way of putting this, after the murder of George Floyd, this nation, I feel, sort of faced a reckoning on race. Now, a lot of you on this call, your life's work has been about race. And for many of you on this call, I'm sure when this country and this state finally found the courage to face the realities of race and racism, you've been doing the work for 30 years. You probably said, hallelujah, welcome. Let's talk about race. Think about how many states or county commissions or city councils or cities or whatever government entity across this country, what other government entity that in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder came together as a community to address issues of race and racism, how many of them have a $20 billion fund at their disposal to invest responsibly in one of the most well-proven strategies that we have in terms of social services, that being early childhood development? I bet you we're the only ones. And here's an opportunity to put the people's money to use to dismantle those systems of racism and oppression by investing it in our youngest children. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Maestas and Representative Martinez. We will open the floor to questions, comments, discussion at this time. Mr. Sanchez.
I want to thank the legislators for being with us here today. They've worked on this for a decade. And over and over again, they win the House of Representatives. Every time they've gone to the floor of the House of Representatives, they have passed. And then to go to the state Senate and die by not having a hearing, and not really a democratic process in that sense. But I think what's very important is that this thing's been vetted for 10 years. The governor has supported it in the past. There's only two things. I know we're recommending and we're using the lenses of the racial justice in what power the governor has. And there's two things the governor can do here. She can support it. It doesn't go to the governor's desk. It'll go from the legislators to the citizens of the state to vote for it. So she can support it like she has been, but now with the strength of the council behind it, and she can vote for it when it's on the ballot. And this will give every New Mexican the opportunity to participate in this. I had a couple questions from our Margaret Montoya and Austin and I. We worked on the memo that you all saw and that you read. There was a question about services. This includes all non-school age children, early childhood services, and the money would go through the new department that's created. So there was a question about home visiting. Yes, home visiting, prenatal services would be included in this. And but when we write a constitution change, it can't be real long. It's not the Enabling Act. It's making the money accessible for us. And the question also that came to me was one of our council members asked was, are we going to damage the other beneficiaries? No, all boats rise. So when we raise this distribution to 6% of the 5-year rolling average, every one of those beneficiaries will receive more money. They'll get their share from their portion of what they own of the trust. This would only come from the common schools portion. We're in reality asking that we make this archaic distribution formula catch up to the science that early childhood is where education begins. When we added kindergarten, we didn't go to Congress and we didn't have a constitutional amendment we just added it and we paid for kindergarten. When this was created in 1910, we didn't have high school. And when high school was added, there was no legislation. It just continued and was added like science. So in this same sense, we want to add early childhood so we have that continuum from birth, for the 20 years of education. And this will help that continue. The common schools portion will go up because we'll be getting part of that for early childhood. But it's important to understand that the common schools gets an increase every year because there's the distribution of 5%. Every time the fund has gone up by $1 billion, K through 12 has received 50 million. So without any legislation, in every year they receive 50 billion more because that's the average of its growth. But thank you, Javier and Mo. You've done wonderful work. It's been vetted for 10 years and it's ready to go to the governor.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you for clarifying something that I want to just stress. The current value of the fund is 20 billion, but if you would have asked us 2 years ago, it was like 17, and next year it'll probably be 21 or 22. So the fund continues to grow. I mean, there's just no stopping it. It has two sources of income: oil and gas royalties and Wall Street investments. So this fund, props to the folks at the SIC and other places. They've done a real good job investing it. Now we're asking for them to invest it in our kids. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less.
Thank you. City Councilor Bencomo.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much, Representative Maestas and Representative Martinez. Congratulations to you both on your wins yesterday. I think our state is very lucky to have you both. I feel like my brain is on fire. That was a great presentation. I have so many questions. I'll just ask them and then you can answer them however you want. I'm curious if you expect, once again, opposition this upcoming year, given, everything that's happening with COVID and who's been impacted. Like I mean, this has made sense to me for a really long time, but specifically now it makes more sense. Do you expect more opposition? The role of this council is to really advise the governor, but is there something else you think this council can do and support? We've been talking about this since the beginning, and so is there anything else you think this council can do? And then sort of my last question is, with the oil and gas being impacted this year with the pandemic, is that set to affect the permanent fund, or in what way will it affect it?
I'll take a crack at it. Javier, thank you so much, Councillor. There will be opposition, no question. I mean, the kind of the conservative power structure, for lack of a better term, will oppose it. Albuquerque Chamber of Commerce, Albuquerque Journal, I don't think we'll get a single vote from the minority party. And folks are just apprehensive to do anything to this fund for 100 years. It's literally a sacred cow. And so so there's always going to be opposition, and it always going to flow with the times. When we're in the worst of economic times, we can't tap it because the economy is in the tank. We need to save it. And then when it was boom time, well, we can't tap it because it's booming. We don't need it anymore. So next year it'll go back to some other kind of argument that oil and gas is low. We can't touch it. Last year, the oil and gas industry, it's our oil. We own the oil. We lease the land to the Chevrons of the world. They drill it. When the oil goes above the ground, it belongs to them. When it's in the ground, it belongs to us. We get 12 cents on the dollar. Mexico gets 87 cents on the dollar for their oil. Saudi Arabia gets like 97. But anyway, I digress. So there's always going to be arguments against it. But that oil money that we made as a state last year was somewhere $900 million. And next year it'll be 600 million. So it'll dip, but it still is an inflow of cash in addition to the 7-8% it grows through financial markets. So our fund grows 11%. And in a perfect world, the distribution tracks with the growth of the fund, but our fund keeps growing and our distribution doesn't grow with it.
Thank you, Representative. I'm curious if there's anything else you, oh my gosh, is someone else speaking? Sorry.
Thank you.
I think someone is trying to speak, but I can't tell who. Counselor, you can you can restate your final question that you had.
Thank you. I would love to hear from either of you, just to reiterate my earlier question, what you think this council can further do to really support this initiative.
Thank you, Councillor. I think this council came together with so many well-regarded experts and practitioners is a huge win for the state. And I say that as a legislator, but I also say that as a practitioner of anti-racist work. I think that having this council help, and I don't know what the right word is, but help endorse or prioritize this proposal would go a long way in helping us shape our strategy and our arguments to the legislature in the 2021 session. Because I think that whatever comes out of this council will be taken with a great deal of seriousness by the legislature and I think by the public in general. And so as we get ready to reintroduce this piece of legislation, to have your formal endorsement, support, whatever it is that you call this process that you've set in place, will go a long way in helping us and in elevating this as an issue about racial equity and racial justice, because ultimately that's what it is. We can get lost in the numbers and the percentages. At the end of the day, this is an issue of racial equity, and here's an opportunity for the state to do something significant for the people of the state.
Thank you, Representative. Dr. Corinne Sanchez, I see your comment. Did you want to come on mic? Your question?
Yeah, yes, I had read the report and recommendations from the subcommittee and submitted a report that we conducted on doula services for Indigenous and women of color communities. And again, naming and language is really important. So just to push forward and continue to hopefully uplift, you know, that the early childhood education piece include that birth justice work around midwifery, doula care, and home visiting programs, because these programs have served our IPOC communities, you know, successfully since their inception. And so I think it's really important around all of the ACEs that you're talking about in the report, ensuring that young people and young children have, and our families have that, the hand and, you know, all of that they need in order to succeed. And so I just want to, again, reiterate that. And I shared that report with the subcommittee committee members. And so I can share that with everyone as well.
I absolutely agree, Dr. Sanchez, 100%.
Thank you.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Senator Lopez.
Thank you. Wanted to say to my colleagues, thank you for your always on spot presentation. You know, and I think for committee, for our council members, there has been a roadblock in the past with this measure when it's come to us from the House. But this year with the new election, with our new members, we have a new day coming in the New Mexico State Senate. So I also wanted just to alert our council members too, that when this bill comes to us at the House, this year it's going to pass. So we'll have that wonderful opportunity, and with the support that we can give from council, of course, recommendation to the governor's office, and of course for her, that adds so much more firepower as we take this across from one chamber to the other. And also there may be an argument, maybe not so much from us, but you will remember that we also have put together a early childhood trust fund where monies were put together, put it aside. But the only amount of money that we really get from that to support early childhood is maybe $30 million a year until that fund continues to grow. And as part of our budget process is that if our budget zeroes out, bottoms out, we can still go back to that fund, trust fund, and take some of that money away, which we did during special session. And we've done the same thing with the tobacco oversight. I sit on that committee also. It's a trust fund set up to help healthcare issues. But if the budget bottoms out, guess where we borrow money from? Actually, we never give it back, but we just take it. So there's an issue from some of the arguments that may be brought up. Well, we already have a trust fund set. Yeah, but it's not, we can always take it away anyway. So to me, there's not a permanency. We don't have a permanent stream of money that goes into and supports our early childhood endeavors. So I just wanted to add that because I know that'll be brought up as part of our discussion. I know the House may not have it, but I know we're going to have it in the Senate. So I just wanted to bring that as part of the dialogue too, as we move this measure forward. So just wanted to add that in. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lopez. One moment, Mr. Sanchez. I wanted to make sure, and thank you, Representative Maestas, for engaging in the chat. I wanted to make sure Fatima's question had been answered. Okay, great. And then Mr. Sanchez and Janine.
Yeah, I wanted to putting on our lenses for the racial justice. So we have that imagery strong, is that intergenerational wealth was stolen when this lands and this trust was made. You know, these properties, as we've said before, came from indigenous people, from Mexican Spanish land grants, and that wealth then wasn't part of their generation to generation. And now the most vulnerable, the youngest populations of the people that lost these lands don't have access to this money. So regardless if the fund would be depleted or not, when we look at the racial justice argument, it is the right thing to do because it's that redistribution which will build the social equity, the social capital in those populations that were robbed. That's the social racial justice in the argument.
Thank you. Janine. I don't know if you're able to come on mic. I can't hear you. I can see you unmuted, but we can't hear you. So I will read it out. Janine puts in the chat, the language also needs to adequately reflect culturally appropriate early childhood education and services. It just moved, sorry. Part of the continued injustices and ongoing ethnic genocide of Indigenous peoples includes the provision of state-sponsored childcare service and education that still serve assimilation goals.
Ms. Taylor, should we address that or?
Sure.
No. I mean, we now have, unlike when we started this, we now have a cabinet level department for early education. And we need a Marshall Plan for early childhood education without ever defunding it. So yeah, working with TRIAC, developing this, certifying teachers and getting this infrastructure going. And no question about it. And the Yazzie plaintiffs remind us in their briefs that this is what needs to happen for us to be successful New Mexicans on this earth. It just strikes me that Congress in 1898 tells me as an appropriator what to do with state lands in the year 2020.
Yeah, and Representative, I'll add to that too as well. Just the fact that because those points are super important, Ms. Yazzie, and I don't know if you're on camera, I can't see you, but those are very important points. And I believe, and I know Representative Maestas believes as well, early childhood should not be cookie cutter, one size fits all. Throw all the kids in the classroom and whatever, right? I mean, I think every community is going to have a different way of doing it. I'm a big believer in multicultural and multilingual education, starting with the earliest years, and any and every resource that we have available to us needs to be invested through that lens. We don't want to make the same mistakes that we've made historically with like K-12 education, for example. Gives rise to the Yazzie Martinez arguments, which are very strong arguments. We want to make sure that we do this right when it comes to early childhood. So thank you for raising those issues, and you certainly have not only our commitment, but you have our strong alliance on that work that we know goes far beyond this one proposal.
And a quick point, Javier, Ms. Taylor. So none of that stuff would be in the legislation. The legislation merely changes 5 to 6 or however high we wish to distribute the funds.
Thank you. Austin, I did see your hand up. I don't know if you still had a question or comment. No, okay. Any other discussion, questions, comments? I did agree with the counselor, Mr. Sanchez, that I appreciated you giving us the 2 points of action, but my note was, what is the other action? What else can we do? And so thank you for that, for answering that. Anything else for Representative Maestas and Representative Martinez? Great. Well, we appreciate your joining with us today to discuss this really important issue. Thank you so much, and congratulations to you both.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you all. Have a great night.
Thanks for having us. Good night.
Good night. Okay, thank you all. With that, I want to actually move to the work group that did a phenomenal job working on this, which was Alan, Mr. Sanchez, Austin, and I know that the subcommittee members may not be here to discuss with you all, but I did want to move into discussion over you all's recommendation, and so that we can decide what we're going to do on this topic. So Austin, Alan, do you want to just give us an overview of what your work group did?
I want to first of all acknowledge the important research and work that Margaret Montoya did. And she's worked on this kind of work for 27 years as a law professor at UNM, and that was very, very helpful, bringing that knowledge, that research, and Austin and the feedback that we were able to get. I think we had the easiest job of all so far in these subcommittees. Given that this thing's been vetted for 10 years, we've had all the red herrings for 10 years, we've had all these bridges to cross, answer the questions, cross the T's and dot the I's. So the document that you received there, you can also see more of this if you go to investingkidsnow.com. Investing Kids Now shows you the history and development and how all these hurdles have been overcome. And I think the document that was sent to you pretty much explains the position on it. The governor's power in this is important. Now she doesn't go to her desk like I mentioned, but her endorsement, she's endorsed it in the past. And some roadblocks have been taken away. I think now when she can come forward with the ethical and moral authority and the backing of this group, brings it to another level. We've won the arguments through the years. First, when we first introduced this 10 years ago, the argument from the opposition was that early childhood programs didn't prove themselves, that they didn't work, and we've won there. The legislature now, I don't think there's anybody that denies that in either side of the aisle. The early childhood programs work. They've accepted that. It's a big victory. And then the funding source, they kept saying, well, we'll let you, we'll take stuff from the general fund. We'll give you from the general fund. And you've heard these arguments that it's been increased, but when you increase by nothing, by 100%, it's still nothing. A great amount of that funding, and I think Senator Lopez can also give us some information about that, is the K-5 plus. That's important, but that's elementary. That's not what this constitutional amendment is about. It's not about elementary age children. It's about the non-school age children. And so it's been refined down to a specific population that we have left behind, that the science tells us this is where we can change the trajectory, and especially because it's intergenerational. It's child and parent. And so Margaret, can you give access, Amy, to Margaret? Could you make some comments?
Yes, Amy, are we able to add Professor Montoya? There we go.
I wanted to make a short clarification about the role of the council with respect to the governor. We haven't been given a formal charge, but at the first meeting and then on the governor's website, there is an explanation or a description of what the council can do. And one of the roles of the council is to provide, and let me quote from it, because it says, to counsel the administration on issues of racial justice. And so it is in that role that I think that we can bring forward the arguments that are made in our memo. That we are bringing forward the arguments that have to do with the history of the fund. We are bringing forward arguments on racial inequities. For example, the Generational Equity Index that has been used to really make a balance between future generations and current generations. But as the land commissioner explained, it's really out of balance. The current generations have been shortchanged. And so there are many arguments that are fiscal arguments. I think that you heard those from Representative Maestas. What we tried to do is we tried to compile a set of arguments that go to both the injustices of the past, the injustices of the present, including some of the arguments of the opponents, but why it is prudent for the governor to see this as a significant step towards redressing racial inequities in the most vulnerable of the citizens. And these are the children about to be born and the children that are just born. And so I you know, like Mr. Sanchez, who has been such a courageous advocate for this program, I think that his work should be recognized. I was honored to work with him and the other members of the workforce. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Montoya. Any other questions, discussion? I had a question regarding what Dr. Sanchez shared regarding you know, the comprehensiveness of what early childhood education is. And then I just saw Representative Mo Maestas said that that's defined in statute, but I'm wondering if there's room in what's recommended by us to have that language reflected, if we so choose, right, around the 0 to kindergarten and the need for the comprehensiveness of midwifery and doula services and the cultural competency piece or culturally relevant piece, and whether this work group would see adding that into your memo as acceptable.
That would be very acceptable.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes, we can certainly add that language. I think it strengthens it. Definitely.
Great. Yes, Dr. Romero.
You know, I think Alex, you're kind of getting into some of the thoughts I'm having, and I don't know if it all has to be thought out right now, but I'm curious about what are the outcomes going to be. So we're looking at possibly 3- and 4-year-old programs, strengthening those programs, you know, and some of the needs that we have across the state is, of course, getting the teachers. We don't have enough teachers for that, so will that go into educational programs with the universities? Another issue is infrastructure. We don't have enough classrooms across the state to be able to do this, even if we know we have the kids, even if we have the funding, we don't have the classrooms. And of course, everything else that goes into that when it comes to curriculum and instruction and those pieces. So I don't know if we want to be detailed to actually have some thoughts about where this money will go and how it'll be used, or is it going to just be able to go over into the Department of Early Childhood and let them decide? Did you guys have any conversations about that?
Yes, we envision that there'll be a lot of time spent, and there'll be other fights, there'll be other debates coming about how first we have to make the money available. It's like if you build it, they will come, but if you don't even have the money to start building, So this is it's interesting when the legislature, they always want a plan, like they want details of who's going to be contracted to do this. And when we build highways, we're never specific of who's going to do the base course and who's going to be doing the striping. They make the money appropriate, and then people will apply to have those contracts. In the same similar way, that's how the CYFD in the past has worked, and this new early childhood department is working, that some of the services are provided directly by government agencies, and then some are by nonprofit contractors. But in a constitutional amendment, we can't spell all that out. So there will be times that we're going to have to, our work isn't done. We're going to have to keep working for quality and for the proven programs. But we already know there's a lot of data coming in. LFC is talking about some success that's happened with programs. We have a longitudinal study. CHI St. Joseph's Children has funded a $2 million study with the University of New Mexico Department of Social Research with Paul Guerin. And we're 5 years into this, and the outcomes are amazing on returns of home visiting. So that's going to be a work in progress, and this is just the beginning of the work. So like your questions are important ones, but we don't have all the answers for them, but we do have a department now. And then that was the big opposition. Where's the money going to go? It's going to go to this department. The unmet need, if the money just went to the unmet need, it's $400 million. We're projecting this to generate from 150 to 180 million a year. The unmet need is 400 million. That's a study by Dr. Kathy Kenny. The state says that the unmet need is closer to 240 million. That's still almost $100 million shy. We probably could spend a whole 100 million if we just raised eligibility for child care to 250% poverty. So our need is really, really big, and this is about approximately a third of what we'll actually need someday to be fully funded.
Thank you. And Austin.
Yeah, I think like just to echo everything that was said. So like number one, we need to remember that this specifically is kind of, it does have to be short because ultimately what this will end up going on the ballot in the form of a constitutional amendment and voters will vote on it. I think that it has been pretty well reflected that it's been basically a referendum from the electorate that like, yes, we support candidates who support early childhood education. And that's been like pretty consistent across the board that is who is getting elected. So I'm fairly confident that if we were able to move it through right now, that it could likely pass. I think it's hard to argue against and say that children are not a good investment. The other thing, there's going to be a lot of talk over, oh boy, you're glad you have a rainy day fund right now, which is, I think, kind of inappropriate. Also, making sure to point out that, whole generations missing out on early childhood education and an opportunity at equitable achievement should feel like an emergency to us. And then lastly, I think that really for us, this just kind of represents, just like Alan had mentioned, I think it represents an open door more than all of the very specific and also equally important legislation that will come pursuant to this. But like this will open a bunch of other doors to different ways that we need to approach problems. Specifically stuff like excluding impact aid as federal revenue. The truth is everywhere is underfunded, Native schools especially so, but whether or not, we're getting people to support trying to get that money to go where the federal government intends for it to go, at the expense of other students, I think that becomes a much easier conversation to have once everybody has a little bit more pie to slice from. And we can start talking about transferring that equitability around, because right now we're sort of fighting over table scraps. And we haven't really ever been properly funded here in New Mexico. So this is an opportunity to probably get closer to that. That way we can start talking about creating some of those funding imbalances to start to create greater equity. So it represents an open door. There will be a lot of conversation about education, but this is a start. A big start, but a start.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate and value this discussion. I think the question for me is still like, is there another action, right? Like, so if the council supports HJR1, right, what is the other action? And I think one of the things that's been coming up for me in this discussion is, do we want to and are we able to articulate a priority area that this specific issue falls under, so that it's not just recommending HJR1, but that there's room to have discussions about some of these other questions that are coming up right here in this council meeting today, but recognizing all of the people who've invested so much time into working on this and thinking through some of the answers to that. And so how could we articulate that actually as a priority area, where this is one of the, it's like the first action we're taking as a council on that? Thoughts about that?
I think that as this is like a beginning, it's a beginning, more things to come. But we have to be specific to what the ask is. This will be one of the largest investments in a 10-year period. It'll be over $1 billion, actually close to $2 billion invested. So it's a huge investment. It's a huge step forward. It'll create 4,000 jobs over 3 years. We haven't had do anything like that. So I think in your question, I think the important part is sometimes you have to be practical and specific, and then we can continue on more, because if our council goes on during this term of office of Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, then we can come forward in other seasons with addressing like the accountability acts that some are in place, more will have to come. And the question in this, I think, that comes in front of us in acting, and not to overreach, I'm always challenged by the opposition about I'm not responsible by promoting this, and is it 5%, is it 6%, what's the responsible number? But I think the council can come back and ask this is the real question: what's the responsible number of children to leave behind? Because at this point, we're leaving 75% behind that don't get the pre-K, and 96% behind that don't get the home visiting. So I think trying to go forward is that we're not going to eat the whole elephant tonight, but this sure gets it going. I mean, this is the barbecue. This is when we're going to start things moving. If this legislation it goes to the voters and the voters approve it, this council will have a lot more work to do, and I believe we'll be together for the next 2 years or maybe the next 6 years.
Thank you. Councillor Bencomo, and then we're gonna move to our point of action on this.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I similarly am having a similar reaction to you, and I don't know if this is, and I hear also what Mr. Sanchez is saying, right? But I'm wondering if I'm thinking also about like narrative, like can this council be part of creating a counter narrative to that opposition? And is it through op-eds? I don't know, Alex, if this is sort of what you were thinking or not. Perhaps you were thinking more policy, but I am also thinking like in between now and the legislative session, what can this council do to create a story about this? What is like the story that we want to tell that perhaps the representatives have not necessarily not been able to tell, but like it hasn't maybe their role to tell. Like this council, though, I think can play a really important role in the story that gets told around this particular piece of legislation. I'm certainly not necessarily a master of words, but perhaps someone in this council is, and can take a crack at an op-ed or something that we can all co-sign, that I think could be really powerful, and perhaps even share it across outlets across the state. But I think for me, that would be one important sort of small but significant next step in the, between now and the legislative session.
Yeah, thank you. I think we are thinking similarly. And I was, the generational equity piece really stuck in my mind around what is the narrative around that, right? This is about generational equity and I think there's a place as a racial justice council that's really poignant. So I see the language here around adding into the memo, which I think the work group agreed around the culturally responsive and community-based education. And so first moving to a point of accepting this work group's memo and this becoming a full recommendation from the council with this additional language. Are we at that point?
So, Alexandria, if I may?
Yes.
This is Margaret Montoya. I think that we can add to this section about the sense of the council in terms that would summarize the comments that have been made in order to strengthen, to make sure that is appears in the memo, in the briefing memo. We can certainly do that. I think that another thing that we can do is, some of the most promising research in ethnic studies is on kindergarten and pre-kindergarten ethnic studies programs. And so there is definitely research out there to show that there are real innovations being made in culturally responsive curricula and pedagogy at this age group.
I think those are important additions. So I think the same action we took with the last point of action is with the recommendations that we just discussed, and thank you, Professor Montoya, for summarizing that, this be adopted as one of the priority recommendations from the council. That sounds great. Thumbs up, I agree. If there's any concern, you can certainly come on mic or raise your hand. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you all for that great discussion. I want to check in. Are there any updates from any of the work groups that have met? And then I want to be mindful of time as well. So any updates from any of the other work groups before we move into scheduling going forward? None at this time. Oh, Rabbi Linick.
I can just say very briefly that with Dr. Romero, we've been working together to discuss Senate Bill 17, as well as Senate Bill 284. And we're planning to come forward with some recommendations of how to strengthen both of those bills.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Did you have any addition?
It's been a wonderful discussion. We've talked with many constituents and experts around the field of excessive use of force. I think we've learned a lot about this whole process along the way, the history of it. And we're also looking at legislation in other states that has been very eye-opening about how we can possibly give some feedback, how to even strengthen some of the possible legislation. So we're close to being able to bring this back. Hopefully in the next week or so, we'll have some recommendations for the committee.
Thank you all so much. That moves to one of the things I wanted to discuss, our time together around finalizing our report in advance of legislative session is winding down quickly. And so the other two subcommittees, Health and Education, are meeting this week and hope to have their reports finalized within the next week. And so I would propose that we actually schedule another full council meeting for next week instead of waiting for 2 weeks, recognizing that next Wednesday, the 11th, is Veterans Day. And so I would propose that we move the meeting to Thursday, the 12th, if that would work for council. That way we can get the reports from the other two subcommittees in case we, like tonight, end up adding additional language before we can finalize those reports, and also hear from more of the work groups. Yes, Amy.
Thursday is the day that the subcommittees meet.
I thought the subcommittees were meeting tonight. Oh, they're regular meetings. If they're finalizing their reports after they meet tomorrow, could they just then present to us on the 12th, or do they have presenters already scheduled?
I don't know. Kaylee, Shawnee, do you have it in front of you if we have stuff scheduled? I thought that we had speakers scheduled already.
Yes. This
yes.
is Kaylee with the health subcommittee, and we do have presenters next week presenting on paid sick leave and paid family sick leave. So another big important topic. Tomorrow we hope to come to a more narrow list, focus list. We have a working group session, but yeah, Thursday we do have at the same time as this meeting from 4 to 6 a presentation.
Okay.
Public safety and law enforcement also has presenters scheduled, and we meet 12 to 1:30 for the 12th. So Amy, is there a reason why we couldn't still meet at 4 and hear from education and the other work groups? I should ask first if folks are open to having an additional meeting next week, and if Thursday at 4 would work, if we can figure this out. Okay. I just want to keep us moving forward, because by the 18th is when we want to be making our final decisions on what that first report to the governor is going to be. And so I want us to have a chance to hear from all of the work groups next week and the subcommittees before we make those final decisions.
Yes, sorry, I had too many mute buttons on. So definitely we need to, or I'm hoping that you all will agree to another meeting next week. But I really want to make sure that it's not at the same time that a subcommittee is meeting, because there are several people on the council who have been attending those subcommittee meetings, particularly the ones that we'll be talking about this next week. I think are a lot of interest to those folks on the main council.
Okay, so do you suggest we go back and identify another date, and we'll send that, see if we get...
Yeah, that would be a good idea.
Okay, we'll do that. We will send that out for, we'll send that out this week to identify the time for next week, and thank you all. And the plan there, I think it's for us to hear from the subcommittees, the remaining 2 subcommittees on the reports that they are hopefully finalizing tomorrow, as well as from the remaining work groups, if there's anything that needs to feed into our final plan. Giving an opportunity for us to provide feedback and for edits to be made before we make our final decisions on the 18th. That sounds good.
And just as a reminder that we did agree that we would give people information out the Monday before the meeting. So that is essentially 2 days, so that if we move a meeting to Thursday or Friday, if you all can provide any written proposal to make sure that I have the time to get it out to the full council within 2 days before the meeting, so that they are able to prepare by reading it.
Thank you, Amy. All right, you all, deep breath. It's been good being in this space with you. We'll leave and go back to our worlds. And so I really appreciate you all, and I wish you all wellness and safety. Take care of yourself and those you love and your neighbors. And we will get next week scheduled soon. I appreciate you all. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, everybody. Don't forget, flu shots are wonderful for you to have. You can always go to Together New Mexico to get more information on that. Bye. Have a good evening.
Good night. Everybody be safe.